Forgiving is one of the most important things that we as Christians do. And it's also one of the most difficult. I'm sure many of you have stories of times where you dealt with someone that was difficult to forgive, that maybe it took some time, or maybe even that you're still working to forgive. For some of you, this story that I'm about to tell will probably be very familiar. Many years ago, when I was helping serve at a nonprofit, there was a young woman there. We'll call her Jessica. And Jessica was in charge of many of the projects we were working on. In fact, she had her own group of folks that worked on particular projects that she was passionate about. And Jessica was a pretty charismatic person. She had a lot of passion, which was good. She also didn't always get along well with those above her, so there was sort of that rebel with a cause attitude she had that was very appealing to work under. One of the projects that she wanted to do was to have an appreciation day for everyone that was helping with the organization. And this, of course, was in the midst of many other projects that I was working on and that other people were working on as well. And for this, there was one presentation that she wanted myself and another person to work on. Now, this other person, whether because of motivation or because of other tasks, I don't know, was not particularly helpful, so we figured a way to divvy up tasks so that we could actually get some things done. And we were working hard with the little time that we had in the midst of everything else we were doing. And we got to about the middle of the week, right when this presentation was going to be done on that Friday. And I went and told Jessica what we had ready to present. And when I think my fellow partner had to go and do something else, and so it was just me, she looked at me and she said, "This isn't good enough. I'm really disappointed in what you're doing." Kind of with that tone. It wasn't a yelling tone. It was one of those angry, very soft tones. That's almost more scary as opposed to yelling because there's sort of a sinisterness there. It was in that moment that I saw Jessica really for kind of who she was. I saw what those who were frustrated with her, the leaders of this organization, were seeing. And I think some of this, to be fair to her, was her being unsure, her wanting to make sure that this whole project went well, and maybe a little bit to say, "Hey, you leaders, this is what I can do." But I was absolutely flabbergasted and probably fearful and just very hurt and upset. And so I took the rest of the week and worked till midnight, sometimes past that, to make sure that I basically scrapped everything I'd already done and in a few days cobbled together something that I thought might be what she was looking for. Again, this was in the midst of several other projects I was working on for this organization, one which I was getting ready to put on and lead myself. And this had an impact on me. I remember one day around this time, a friend of mine saw me on the bus as I was collapsed over and came up and asked me if I was doing okay. And shortly thereafter, I was sick for about a month's time. Jessica never came up and said anything. She never said, "Job well done." She didn't say, "Job not well done," but she didn't say anything else. And so there was a lot of anger that I had there built up towards her. And unfortunately, two things. I still had a lot of things that I was working under her for this organization. And I'm also someone who tends to bottle things up. So I'm still having to work with her and just letting this anger seethe inside me and grow and kind of eat at me and make every moment that I'm working with her difficult. And that was until one day when, I think after she was complaining about the leaders of our organization again, she came up to me afterwards and smiled and said, "How are you doing?" And it was in that moment that I realized something. That she had no idea what she had done. She had no idea what was going on. She was completely and utterly clueless. And it was then that I remembered something that our Lord said from the cross, in fact. That he looked on those who were putting him to death and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And in that moment, it was all the easier to forgive Jessica. Now, that's not to say that it was sort of this happened and then immediately all things went away. There was still a process. There was still time to work through that anger. And in fact, many years later, I saw that she received an award for some work that she'd been doing for another nonprofit. And some of those feelings, some of those emotions came back. And in fact, it took talking to one of my closest friends who knew of the situation, who'd been with me during all of this. It really took talking with her to work through these issues again. Now, in the gospel today, Jesus tells us, in the words that we hear from the New Revised Standard Version, that we should forgive 77 times. Some translations translate this as 70 times 7, which I think in some ways is the better translation. Now, the idea here, and keep in mind this whole reading is a continuation of what we heard last week, where Jesus is telling us how to approach our friends and neighbors and to let them know that they have done something wrong. And in fact, where he also says that if they continue not to listen, that they are to be thrown out. But that in all situations we should do our best to try to bring back into our fold. And so in that spirit, we're not putting just a small little limit, like 7 times. We're saying for all the various sins that someone continues and continues and continues to sin against us, we are to forgive them 77 times or even 70 times 7. So it's quite a lot. But I think there's another thing that we can infer from what Jesus says. That forgiveness is a process. That even for one sin against us, sometimes it takes a while for that anger to subside. Sometimes it takes us time, maybe 70 times 7 times, to continue to let go of that anger, to continue to forgive this person for what they've done to us. Part of the reason that we forgive isn't because our anger isn't righteous. And it's not because the pain that's been caused to us just goes away. Part of the reason we do it is it's a reminder to us of the very things that Jesus has done for us, of God's own forgiveness for us. And that's seen very clearly in the parable today. The issue with the slave is that he does not do what the master does for him. He doesn't forgive the sins of the other slave, just as the master forgave him of his own slaves. Forgiveness is a reminder to us of what God has done for us, because we've all sinned against God, whether directly against him or through the harm that we have caused one another. The other thing that we gain through this parable is that sin, that holding on to that anger, holding on to our anger at the sin of others against us, continues to eat away at us. It eventually destroys us, just as we see the anger with the slave eventually leads to his own demise. And again, in this we can often follow Jesus' own example and realize the people who've sinned against us don't always know what it is that they're doing. They're not thinking about how what they're doing affects us. They're not thinking about the long-term consequences of their actions. And that's what we see in the reading from Genesis this morning. There we have Joseph and his brothers. And for those who remember the story, Joseph, with the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, is thrown into a hole by his brothers and then sold into slavery. Because they're not thinking about how this is going to affect them tomorrow or a month from now or even, as so happens, years later. They're not thinking about those consequences. They're just thinking that little Joseph keeps interrupting their lives. He's making it harder, which he is. He's kind of a little jerk. And they're thinking that their lives would be that much better without him in it. Now, what the brothers did was terrible. And I'm not going to say otherwise. It was a terrible act that they did against their brother. And yet, years later, God's able to take their sin, that bad action, and he's able to transform it. And it becomes something that ends up leading to the salvation, not just for Joseph, not just for the land of Egypt, but the salvation of his brothers from the famine hitting the land as well. We see God ultimately doing this in his death on the cross. Here we have one of the greatest actions of injustice, the killing of the one noble and just human being to have ever lived on earth in the most brutal way, well, one of the most brutal ways, humanly possible to endure. This is a very bad thing that was done. And yet God is still able to take that action and to transform it, to lead to the salvation of us all. Forgiveness can be a very difficult thing for all of us, because oftentimes there are things that are done to us that leave us justifiably angry. But we have to realize that we have done the very same thing to God. We have sinned against Him and against our neighbor. We have done those things which we should not have done to others. But God is still there, willing to bring us back. In the words that Jesus says in John chapter 8 to the woman of ill repute, God is still there telling us, go, sin no more. God is trying to bring us all back in. We can't change the past. We can't change those things which we've done wrong. But we can move forward. We can move forward being transformed. And so we are called to give that very same opportunity to others. The opportunity to move forward, new and transformed. We're called to be like Jesus, to take this pain and suffering that we have endured at the hands of others and turn it into something good. We're called to transform it into something new, something powerful, something life-giving.